Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 53rd video in our Master Series, the 23rd video in our first phase processing, and the second video on equalization. In this video, I want to address an issue because I've seen a lot of people have serious problems understanding the difference between sound sculpting equalization and static equalization. The problem here is that if you go back and revisit that video, Master Series 40, we were doing sound sculpting. Now, when we do sound sculpting, that let's say that I have this track. Now, I've got this track here and I've looped a little section. Most of the time that you want to use that test capture that we talked about during recording so that you have one word to work on, or some words, a low note, a high note, and things like that, to see if there's any, what kind of processing works best on it. And having a note that isn't going around all over the place is a really good idea. But I used just a section of the song here to give an example. Now if I've looped this and I'm listening to it and I'm finding that where I'm having issues with here, and I'm trying to find some place I loop one word or some other thing and start trying to figure out if I attenuate this frequency, boost this frequency, and instead of having this moving landscape around that's really hard to try to sculpt on, that then I can put automation on it, so that I've found these frequencies on my test capture that I had the lady sing whatever's going on, so that I've got some vocal range, because the transducer changes a little bit. It's singing different things. So to try to figure out what best way to do it if I'm going to do sound sculpting on it. So after that, I've gone through with an EQ and I've put automation on it. Like we had talked about in that video, I've automated those nodes in this parametric EQ to follow around those problem frequencies, and then I boosted them to the amount that I wanted to, and I added the Q that I wanted on them, the width, the bandwidth, and I've adjusted them in this loop. Then I test it through the whole production, to see if it has to be adjusted or changed in certain areas. This is sound sculpting. The understanding of this is this vocal or whatever instrument, vocals are very hard because it's not as static as most instruments. There's so many little fluctuations and changes with vocalists that sometimes this work can be very tedious and very hard because of how complex that the vocal is and the human transducer is, that sometimes you guys spend a lot of time on it because it's such a complex tool or a transducer. So, but anyway, the concept is this is sound sculpting. So I went through there and I know that this vocal is, for the most part, has this envelope of sound that is their, timbre. For lack of a better word, the timbre of their voice, or timbre, or however you want to say it. But it's moving up and down the spectrum. It doesn't stay static in one place like they sing an A, da 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 da. Does that make sense? So it's moving around. So static EQ is not going to sound sculpt that. It's just not. It's not going to work. So if you want to really sound sculpt that sound, let's say the lady's got problems in these areas to where it doesn't sound that good. So you want to start, sound sculpting on it. You got to be real careful that you don't change their sound. Where, an extreme example that she sounded like, Donald Duck, and now that she sounds like Whitney Houston. Well, you've done some serious sound sculpting, bro. You did a pretty good job. But, that's an extreme version. You can't fuss with it too much on things like vocals, where on other instruments you can, because you actually change their sound too much. To where, if they're that bad that, if they're not, does that make sense? So you got to be real careful of that. But doing some sound sculpting on it is that's a moving spectrum. It's moving around in the spectrum, and you're sculpting on it to make it sound as good as possible in its range. Does that make sense? It may be in this frequency range, but it's it's inside there when they're singing. It's got a range of here, but their actual envelope singing is moving around in that range, and you want to sculpt that sound so it sounds as good as possible inside of that range. Now, this is where it gets blurred, because this sound sculpting and static EQ work, sometimes those lines get blurred because you might find you do sculpting on it and then you really don't need to do a whole lot of static EQ work on it, very little. Does that make sense? But it's still a step in my process, because sometimes I won't do sculpting on it. I'll go, no, it sounds pretty good. When I do static EQ work on it, it'll sound fine, because it's going to sound really nice when I get done doing static EQ work on it, because the actual envelope of sound itself doesn't sound too bad. It doesn't have any major issues, and it just needs some static EQ work on it to make it sound as good as possible, so the ear hears it the way it's supposed to. So this is where the lines get blurred. So that is basically sound sculpting, trying to keep that moving envelope of sound, trying to make that moving envelope of sound as good as possible, and dealing with problem issues to make the actual harmonic content complement itself to where it sounds as good as possible. Now, where these lines get blurred is that the issue is in this situation that you've sound sculpted this, okay? So to a really simple understanding of that is you've sound sculpted, and you're done doing your sound sculpting, you're going to go on to your static EQ work. So the steps of doing the static EQ work for me, I do high-low pass filtering, some notch filtering to look for problem areas. Then I do equal loudness contour work. When I get done with that, then I go through and I do sweep. I do sweep EQ work looking for problem areas need to get boosted and attenuated and things like that the equals loudness contour may not take into consideration for this individual instrument sound or whatever I'm working on. And then I go back again, I do high-low pass filtering again and notch filtering to clean things up. That way I do a really good job when I'm doing my static EQ work. Now, when we're talking about the static EQ work, another thing that's going to come into play is how it sits in the mix. So we talked about in the last video, we talked about might go revisit this when you do subgroup processing or group mixing to go back and fix those areas. Because let's say this instrument's just in this range here, right? And you've EQ'd it when this first phase processing, it sounds awesome. But in the mix, it doesn't sound as good. So you go back and revisit the equal loudness contour, is that this area may need to get boosted some. That way, because this area down here, this bass is playing, let's say it's playing somewhere between here, 500 hertz, and down here to 40 or 50 or something. And you're going to want to gradually put a rise on that so that the ear hears it at the same levels. Because if you look, I'll use the equal loudness contour according to this one right here that's set around 80. And, around 500 hertz up to around 1,000 hertz, it's pretty level there. And the problem is you have to boost these frequencies, attenuate these frequencies, boost these frequencies, attenuate those down there, and boost these frequencies up here along these lines so that the ear hears them at the same level. That way that when you hear the guitar and the bass and the drum and the vocals and everything else, you can actually hear them. Nothing gets drowned out because your ear, they don't get lost in the mix because they're at the levels from equalization at the levels they should be, so that they have their own place in the mix and are heard well. So that's a huge concept to get in your head, because later on, even after you do the equal loudness contour work that we're going to show you, you may go back and revisit that and say, well, this one little thing is only in this range and I need to boost that a little bit. Now I can hear it in the mix and it sounds good. Whereas if I go back to that track originally, the way I've got it mixed where it sounds all great by itself, that if I go ahead and boost in just this area so it sounds good in the mix, by itself it doesn't sound as good. But I boosted it in this area, this other instrument's from this range from here to here, and I boosted that way up, and this other instrument's in this range from here to here, and I attenuated that, and this other instrument's in this range from here down, and I boosted that way up. Now I can hear all the instruments clearly. All of them are clear. I can hear them definitely. None of them are muddy and getting lost in the mix, and they all sound like they're around the same level, so that they're heard well and nice and clear, because they're boosted and attenuated in the areas they should be, so that you can hear them clearly in the mix. That's a huge concept to get in your head, and the whole understanding of the equal loudness contour, and why you need to take it into consideration at different steps in the process so that you hear things well the way you should, so things don't get lost in the mix. You sit there and you got the bass, the bass, let's say you've got a bass and it's playing down here and the kick drum's way down here, and you boosting that kick drum up so it has it's being heard as well as the bass guitar. And you've changed the EQ on it just a little bit so that it doesn't conflict with the bass. That's a hard thing to learn because sometimes you just have to change the EQ from those and EQ the bass, the kick drum or something like that, so they don't conflict, so that you can hear them each clearly, even though they're really close in the same spectral range, like we talked about with the guitars. And that is a work in progress that we'll talk about that later on, but I wouldn't worry about it too much right now, but just keep it in your head. So when we do static EQ work, we are going to work along these lines. Static EQ, not any kind of moving automation or anything like that, to try to make the sound as good as possible. Because let's say this vocalist is traveling from down here all the way down here all the way up into here. Does that make sense? She's got a huge range, and you want to take this in consideration, because if you boost in those and subtracting those areas and then go look for problem areas, that her voice will sound badass, because you're boosting and attenuating areas even though she's moving around to make her voice sound as good as possible, because the correct frequencies will be boosted and subtracted so that your ear hears them like it's supposed to, so that it sounds as good as possible. That's a very long-winded way to put it, but it's a very simple concept that will make you have a much better understanding of what you're trying to do when you're doing static EQ work and when you're doing sound sculpting, and understanding the difference, so that you do really good equalization work when you're working at this. Because at this stage, we're doing static EQ work, and I will show you in the next video when we start doing some static EQ work, so you can understand why I'm boosting and subtracting those areas and why my process works like that, so that individual track sounds as good as possible, even though that instrument might be moving around in the spectrum. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope that cleared up some things for you, so you got a little bit better understanding of what we're trying to do and what you're trying to do. And I will see you in the next video when we do some actual static EQ work on this track. Peace, hope, love. See you in the next video.